Do you believe juvenile offenders should be treated as adults? What if you knew the part of their brain that regulates impulses does not fully develop until roughly 25? Does that change things? Today on The Balanced Voice, we sit down with someone whose research is vital to the conversation surrounding the rights and treatment of juvenile offenders.
And what was really distressing is that, in 2005, the United States was one of 3 countries still executing children. That's not a really good hashtag for us to have.
It's actually shocking.
It's shocking. 2005 wasn't that long ago. It's really hard to believe. And you need to pull back just a moment. You mentioned really something about victims and the crimes that these young people commit. And there's no question that a child needs to be held accountable. That's not what anybody is suggesting shouldn't happen. It's not a question of whether they're held accountable, it's how.
That's Dr. Elizabeth Cauffman. Her research addresses the intersection between adolescent development and juvenile justice. She has published over 100 articles, chapters, and books on topics in the study of contemporary adolescence, adolescent brain development, risk-taking and decision-making, parent-adolescent relationships, and juvenile justice. She's also a professor at the University of California Irvine, and I'm personally so honored to be learning from her as she's the dean of my graduate program. As a mother herself, Dr. Kaufman approaches conversations about an incredibly challenging topic with clarity and compassion. In today's balanced conversation, we ultimately answer this question: can juvenile offenders stop offending and become healthy members of society? Without further ado, here's your host, Rania Mankarios.
Welcome to the Balanced Voice podcast. We are always so excited to have our guests. And this week we welcome Dr. Elizabeth Cauffman, a professor in the Department of Psychological Science in the School of Social Ecology at the University of California Irvine. Dr. Cauffman, welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
We're so excited to have you. Your bio again, and we're just very lucky to have really fascinating guests on the podcast. And I can't read your whole bio, but I do want to pull out a few nuggets. You hold a courtesy appointment in the School of Education and the School of Law. You received your PhD in developmental psychology from Temple University and completed your postdoc fellowship at the Center of Adolescence at Stanford University. You've written over 100 different articles, chapters, and books on a range of topics and the study of contemporary adolescence, including adolescent brain development, risk-taking, and decision-making. I think everything you're doing is fascinating. And so we were just sort of not joking about, but really I was watching like every video you've ever done, trying to read all of the research. And I really want to start here. You are looking at what gets kids out of crime, not what gets kids into crime. You're taking into account the science and you're asking, can we design a system that is more developmentally appropriate to meet the needs of kids? Talk to us about that.
Happy to. I think one of the things that's really easy to do is we could all sit together and brainstorm all the risk factors of what gets people into crime. And we know a lot of things, and science has helped us a lot. But the big question is do any of these kids stop? That's what society is concerned about. It's what we as, people in our neighborhoods are concerned about. Do people stop offending? So we actually launched a large-scale study called Pathways to Desistance. My colleagues, Ed Mulvey and Lawrence Steinberg, integral in that development and leading that study. And what we did was looked at over 1,000 adolescents starting at ages 14 to 17, and we followed them for 7 years. And what we wanted to do, we started with kids who committed very serious crimes, kids that society, basically says these are dangerous young people. And following them for 7 years, the big question we asked was, do these young people actually stop offending? And 2 big findings came out of that study. First, the majority of young people, by the time they reached their mid-20s, had desisted or what we call stopped crime. That is, their criminal behavior really leveled out. This is important because most of them were committing very serious crimes when they were adolescents. And so to reach your 20s and actually see a decline in criminal behavior for the majority of these young people, this was huge. The other big finding was that not everybody followed the same pathway. So you see a lot of what we call heterogeneity, or what's called variability. people follow different pathways. Some people stop right away. Some people take a little longer, but most people stop. And so they follow a different path, but they eventually get there. So what that really told us, and I think what was the hallmark of that study, is that most kids grow up and grow out of crime, because the best predictor for what got these young people to stop was developing impulse control, the ability to think long term, and that then led to their ability to stop their criminal behavior. So part of it is just understanding development and understanding, okay, if we give people time to grow up, we can actually find a better system to treat these young people.
And when you talk about development and the science, you looked a lot at the development of the prefrontal cortex and what that manages in a child's mind in terms of risk-taking, cognitive behavior, being able to respond to scenarios around them. Is that where you felt the biggest factor was in terms of what causes a child to either commit crime or realize they need to turn from a life of crime scientifically?
That's a great question. And I think the research on the adolescent brain or brain development, I mean, it's a hot topic, right? Everybody's talking about adolescent brain development. And when they're talking about it, what you're really talking about is the prefrontal cortex or the frontal lobe. It's the area right behind your forehead. And that part of the brain isn't fully developed until roughly 25 years of age. And I think that science has really provided a framework for people to understand, well, why do kids engage in the kinds of behavior they do? We know the frontal lobe or the prefrontal cortex, it's like the CEO of a company. It runs the business. It's in charge of all that impulse control, that ability to think long-term, the regulations of emotion. And the fact that that part of the brain isn't fully developed until you're 25 gives us some insight into behavior. But we have to be really careful. This isn't to say that adolescents' brains are broken. This is actually very normative. This is how our brains do develop. And this is why adolescence is this great opportunity. It allows us to explore, to experiment, to try new things. It allows us to engage in a lot of different behaviors. But it also helps us explain why sometimes we make some of the stupid mistakes we make. So we're much more than our brains. And I don't want everybody just to think it's all boiled down to brain. But the brain behavior connection is really important. And understanding that connection helps us better understand that, people can change, that people are capable of change, and that as we grow up, we actually do see these young people make change over time.
Dr. Cauffman, when you look at these kids, and they are kids, and you're looking at some children who have committed violent felony crimes, and we join you, we want to say there's got to be a better way at treating those who commit crime. We've got to be looking at their upbringings. We got to be looking at society as a whole. What are schools like? What are families dynamics? Do they have food at home? Do they have proper health care? Do they live in a stable, what we would say, it takes a village to raise a child. What does their village look like? Did you take into account those factors, or were you purely looking at the science?
Well, when we do the science, that's actually a lot of the things that we measure. We actually assess their neighborhoods, their families, their educational experiences, their employment experiences, their peer groups. So when you're doing this kind of research, you can't just look at one factor. Mm-hmm. You know that there are many factors involved. And in fact, in all the research that we do, we look at the whole person in context to get a better understanding of how they change over time.
Okay, so now you have these kids that have committed these crimes, and you have offered great research. You've contributed to two huge changes in the legal system and how we deal with children. I think one out of 2005 and another more recently. I'd like to talk to you about that, actually. Let's pull it up right now. 2005, your research was involved in the Supreme Court's decision to eliminate juvenile death penalty, which is huge. And then in 2012, eliminating juvenile punishment of life without the possibility of parole. I think it was purely, I don't want to add. Talk to us about those two landmark cases.
I think one of the most exciting things is when you see your research actually make a difference. And it's not just me, it's all of science. I mean, it's a team of researchers, and everyone came together to provide a foundation of science, because science takes time. And what was really distressing is that, in 2005, the United States was one of 3 countries still executing children. That's not a really good hashtag for us to have.
It's actually shocking.
It's shocking. I mean, 2005 wasn't that long ago.
And actually, it was researching you that really, I was like, wait a minute, is that real? And yes, it is real. Unbelievable.
It's really hard to believe. And so what was exciting is that, and you need to pull back just a moment. I mean, you mentioned really something about victims and the crimes that these young people commit. And there's no question that a child needs to be held accountable. I mean, that's not what anybody is suggesting shouldn't happen. It's not a question of whether they're held accountable, it's how. And so that, I think, is what the big issue is. You know, in 2005, to put forward the science to say, look, adolescents really are different from adults, and therefore we should be held to different standards. And so execution of our young people, particularly given that we know the science is showing us they change over time and can be rehabilitated and be changed. Given that science, what's the right thing to be doing? The same thing true with, in 2012 in Miller, where they abolished life without the possibility of parole for homicide offenses. That was a huge case because life for a juvenile is equivalent basically to a death sentence, right? Yeah. So holding kids to adult standards, when developmentally we know that they're different, this really forces us to think about how should we hold kids accountable? Because there's no question you need to, but we have to think of more developmentally appropriate ways that we can do that.
You just heard Rania and Dr. Cauffman discuss Miller, the Supreme Court case that abolished prison sentences of life without the possibility of parole for juvenile offenders. Just minutes after we finished filming this episode, the 2012 decision in Miller was altered via the Supreme Court findings in Jones v. Mississippi. We encourage you to learn more about the potential ramifications of this new ruling via our show notes at thebalancedvoicepodcast.com.
It's hard, Dr. Kaufman, though, when you see kids who are on paper children commit such egregious, adult-like, dark crimes. It's really hard to reconcile what you're saying, although the science supports it and everybody's with you. We understand all that you're talking about in terms of brain development, risk-taking, the inability to really understand gravity of consequences. We understand it, but it's so hard to digest when you see a young person do something that is so egregious. And I'm with you. We don't want to, the cradle to prison pipeline, we have to work as a community against entirely. But do you ever get sort of that, well, what do you do in some of these cases? What is the answer?
Oh, if I had that answer, I'd be a really rich person. I think it's a really hard question. But the biggest issue is it shouldn't be the rule. It should be the exception. So the rule shouldn't be the harsh punishment. Now, there's always exceptions to every rule, and those are hard. And this is why I'm not a judge, and this is why we have, the experiences that we do and the systems that we have. But those shouldn't be the rules where we start. And if we can think outside the box and start at a different place, then we could actually maybe make better change long term.
Across the country, there's tremendous amount of conversation about the role of law enforcement in community, about the role of law enforcement in social issues. And certainly we're seeing, an overlap and a nexus between law enforcement and minors who are committing crime. And how do we digest all of this? What would you say? I mean, you've recommended a different approach when dealing with minors. How does that translate when you're training law enforcement officers who are on the field dealing with dangerous situations?
Oh, that's a great question. And in fact, one of my former students who's now a professor, Adam Fine, actually has done a lot of work with our data to actually answer this type of question, which really gets to the area of what we call procedural justice. Procedural justice is about fairness, think of it like when you go to a store or a restaurant, you don't get good customer service. You're like, I'm not coming back, right? It's the same thing. Customer service, how the police treat you and how you feel treated and valued really reflects on whether or not you feel seen and heard by a system. So if you feel that a system is not treating you fairly or justly, why would you want to adhere to that system? And so the research has actually shown that those who feel the system is fair and just are more likely to abide by it. Whereas those who feel the system has unfairly treated them or it is more unjust are more apt to not abide by the rules that the system is putting forth, which falls in line with very much what we see with general human behavior. We're all like this. If we feel something's not fair, why would we want to engage in that? So the police have a very, very hard job. And they're dealing with situations every day that I can't possibly imagine. But they need to know that what they do matters and how they approach it matters. And so knowing that and giving the police those tools to know what you do, what you say, how you engage, and how you make a person feel matters, that gives them something to work toward so that the next time they have that encounter, they know that they can make a difference.
And it's true. But you look at these cases that pop up where, it's almost like I always think about this in terms of being on a plane. And there's a pilot that operates a smooth flight and there's no turbulence, there's no issues. He can say, good morning, welcome to your flight, enjoy 3 hours left, to a pilot that is dealing with an engine failure and literally lives are at stake. It requires a completely different set of responses. And sometimes I think the conversation it's so true, and it's so accurate, but it's also not fair when you're dealing with an officer that comes on the scene and somebody is about to get killed. Somebody may have just gotten killed. You have somebody who's been sexually assaulted or in the process. Does the same rule apply?
It's a great question. And the biggest issue is thinking about having tools in your toolbox. Mm. Not everything's a hammer. Sometimes you need a screwdriver. Sometimes you need, a different, and I'm not a good tool person, as you can see.
We don't know what tools are needed, but different tools, different types of tools.
Exactly. But you're getting my analogy, which is you want a lot of different tools. And I mean, and in particular, one of the things that we've been working with when we work with police is that we actually know, for instance, adolescents are more likely to use what we call their limbic system. That's your emotional center. If you took your fingers and stuck them straight between your ears, you'd be in the center of your brain in the limbic system. It's where your amygdala is. Your amygdala is your fight or flight response system. Adolescents are much more likely to read or perceive emotion from their amygdala, that limbic system. And that's a more primitive system. So you'll actually see adolescents misread cues. You'll actually see adolescents have a more emotional response. Whereas adults are more apt to use that frontal lobe. The connection between the limbic system to the frontal lobe strengthens as we age. So as we age, we can be like, oh, better nuance in that emotion. So when an adolescent is hot or emotional or in a situation and the police come on, the police see it as the adolescent disrespecting them. Whereas the adolescent is like, I've got to protect self. And so if the police have a better understanding of this is how an adolescent is going to respond to you, these are the triggers or an adolescent reaction, then it helps the officer in the moment to go, okay, I know what I'm dealing with. But if we don't give the officers or the police the tools they need and then send them into the field, we're actually just doing a disservice to our police as well.
Setting everybody up for failure in a way. Mm-hmm. Is your research being used right now for law enforcement training?
It has, yes. So we've worked with different police organizations around the country, and I've done a lot of developmental trainings to police organizations. And I know the police are very receptive to always trying to learn more and improve and be better.
So I want to go back, Dr. Cauffman, to now you have a minor. The current system, we hear about the cradle to prison pipeline. The current system, as we know, once a child, and you've done research and we've looked at a lot of research on this, has been arrested and charged and is serving time. The projection of life is different. It shifts. And of course, that depends on gender, on age, on racial background, on so many different things. But we know for the most part, it impacts the longevity and the future of a child. I mean, think about you've talked about, can they vote? Can they get a job? Is it easy to get an apartment? It just impacts their lives. What would you say now are some alternatives? You've mentioned, I think, diversion programs and a few other things. Can you talk us through some of those?
So I'll tell you about two things. One, we've launched a large-scale study called Crossroads, where we followed kids starting at 13 to 17. and they're now in their 20s. We're in the 9-year follow-up. Wow. And basically imagine identical twins, but one kid got a really harsh punishment and one kid got a sort of diversion, do some community service and behave yourself. Realize they've committed the same crime, make them identical in every way. But one of the things that we know is looking at them just 5 years later, the more harshly you treat a person, the worse the outcomes are. You'll see the criminal behavior increase. You'll see the incarceration rates increase. You actually see them have less view of opportunity for their future. And in fact, their schooling and employment is lower. We're making people worse, not better. So we're actually seeing when you have a very first time offender, this is a young person who's committed their very first offense. And it's a minor offense. I mean, if you commit murder, we're not going to give you diversion. But if you commit your
that
first...
was a question. That was one of my questions. Okay.
Yeah. So if you commit this, these were all kids who committed that. What do you do with the kid who just, did a theft, just stole something? Do the crime, do the time. Do you get tough? Do you punish them? Or, kids are stupid. They make stupid mistakes. You have that sort of mindset, second chances. Which one is the right approach? Well, our research is suggesting that when you have a young person in front of you who's committed a low-level offense and you have a decision to make about whether to get tough or give a second chance, the second chance seems to be long-term the better outcome, not just for the young person, but for our communities. They're less likely to continue committing crime. They're more likely to finish schooling. They're more likely to get employed. We want these young people to be productive citizens. So the diversion program in particular, knowing that diversion is a better path, that's the first thing that we came away with. The second thing that we're working on now is we have implemented, working with Judge Hernandez in Orange County, a young adult court. And this is for 18 to 25-year-olds. This is very exciting because this is really moving from just beyond juvenile to that transition to adulthood. And one of the things that we're seeing is that 18 to 25 is actually when you see the highest rates of criminal behavior. 18, 19, 20 is actually your peak. And the question is, what do you do? How do you deal with this young person, particularly someone who commits a low-level felony? For instance, if you steal something of high value, like for instance, in the state of California, anything over $950 is a felony. So if you stole something that was $949, you'd have a misdemeanor. Mm-hmm. But if I stole something $950, I have a felony. $1 separates whether or not I have basically the scarlet letter for the rest of my life. Because once you have a felony, you have to check the box. You can't work certain places. You can't live certain places. I mean, you have to check that box forever. And when you saddle an 18, 19, 20-year-old with that felony for the rest of their life, the doors are closed on so many opportunities for them. So this program is saying, we're going to take these young people, 18 to 25, and if they go through our program and are successful, the district attorney has agreed to either reduce the felony to a misdemeanor or dismiss it altogether. So they have to work. I mean, this is not a get out of jail free card. They're working every week on getting re-engaged in school, on getting employed, on paying their restitution, on doing what they need to do to make things right. It's much more detailed than anything on probation you would see. They're working every week with their case manager, social services, their probation officer. And if they do all that work and make things right, the justice system is also making things right. And that's where I think the justice system and science can really come together. Because you can see we're holding people accountable, but we're also giving them opportunity for change and development to grow and be better.
This balanced conversation is made possible by Brigitte and Bashar Kalai, Hallie Vanderheider, Sippy and AJ Karana, and Deepwater Productions. If you're interested in furthering our mission of facilitating balanced conversations, offering real solutions, contact us at thebalancedvoicepodcast.com.
And I like the approach of taking time using science and actually providing follow-up, because one of the problems we're seeing here in Harris County, and I know across the country, is misdemeanor bond reform, this idea that low-level offenses, we can't be throwing people in jail. They lose their jobs, they lose their apartments, they lose their opportunity for the next chapter of their lives. And everybody agreed with that. And that was passed. And we treat low-level offenses, I think, actually as a country now very differently than even a few years ago. It's when you get to those really violent felony offenders that we have to strike a balance between grace and a risk assessment that includes public safety. The other layer of that is age. How does age play a factor in that? So your diversion program, the court that you mentioned, 18 to 25, does that apply for even those that are on the violent felony spectrum of crime?
No. So our young adult court, the 18 to 25 young adult court, is for felony offenses, but only if they are, I want to say, low level. So if you have great bodily injury or a weapon or something of a serious nature, you are not eligible for that court.
So more like a nonviolent situation.
Yes.
You said something that was interesting early on when we talked about law enforcement. You said the worse you're treated, the worse the outcome. And I think obviously that makes a lot of sense, but it made me think about kids being raised in today's world that are consuming violent video games, violent TV shows, violent graphics. The online challenges are like, try to kill yourself and post it. It's funny. Try to kill somebody else. It's funny. The world's gotten so dark and so violent. Do you think that's played a role in how children are changing developmentally? When you look at all this science, does it factor in the fact that kids today are inherently being raised in a very different climate?
It's a great question. I get asked that often. I'm not a media expert. I have many colleagues and friends who are, and I know the research in this area because, of course, as a parent, you're always worried and always concerned. I have 2 teenagers, so I know. But that's, I'm going to hopefully put everybody at ease. The media doesn't cause us to be violent. If you go back in time, Wile E. Coyote was a very violent cartoon, and we were exposed to very violent things. What I think worries parents and worries our community is that we see a lot of the media use because we're exposed to a lot of media. There's really fantastic research that is being done in this area, and there's 2 really important findings. One, media use among kids actually tends to promote more positive behaviors. They may end up being more connected, more socially connected. Kids actually encourage each other to be more positive with each other. So there's a lot of positive work in the media area. Candace Odgers is an expert in this, so I will defer all that to her. The second, though, is that when you are thinking about violent media doesn't cause you to be violent. We've all watched violent TV shows. We've all seen violence on TV. It doesn't make us go do that. What's important to separate here is selection versus socialization. We are influenced by media we see and we think about things, but those who are going to be more violent, those who are more aggressive, tend to select more aggressive, violent video or media or whatever more often. We're all exposed to it. It doesn't cause us to be that way, but people who are interested in that seek it out more. So that's where you'll see that connection. That's why we call it a selection effect, that there's this desire to engage with more of that media use.
Right. That's very, 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 very fascinating. And I always think when I talk to our incredible guests, I'm always like, that's interesting. That's fascinating. That's interesting. But it really is fascinating and interesting. And, people can agree or disagree on some of the nuances of these points, but I think your final statement there, that people who have violent tendencies tend to seek out violent content, is really true. What we look at is violence in pornography, and this understanding that young boys, let's speak in blanket terms, who start consuming pornography at a young age, have physiological, their bodies respond differently in time and organically and naturally start seeking out more violent footage just naturally. And there's that slow progression that I always think about and I find concerning. And I know that's not your area, but it's just interesting to me. Dr. Cauffman, before we wrap up our time with you, justice by geography was something that I thought was an interesting comment. You were talking about in a TED Talk. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Sure. One of the things I think is really important for people to know is that kids are kids no matter where you live. So the developmental changes that go on as we grow up, it doesn't matter whether you live on the East Coast or the West Coast, North or South, developmentally, kids are developing in the same ways. But what's really interesting is that each state treats kids differently.
Yeah.
For instance, the age at which you can be transferred to the criminal justice system. So you can have young people as young as 10 years old being transferred to the adult criminal system, depending on what state you live in. Depending on what state you live in, you'll get a certain sanction of how long you'll spend in jail. So every state has a different way of treating an adolescent, despite the fact that we know kids are all the same. So this is one of the things that is very interesting when you go across the country and you see how kids are treated in different states and what can happen to a kid depending on where you live.
Dr. Cauffman, you're doing such great work. We're so excited to have you on the Balanced Voice podcast. Special thanks to our executive producer, Sydney Zeiker, for recommending you and is actually doing a program with you right now. We're thrilled. Again, thank you for your time. And we look forward to seeing everybody else next week on the Balanced Voice podcast. Bye, everybody.
Thanks for tuning in to today's Balanced Conversation. You can find real solutions and tangible resources in our show notes at thebalancedvoicepodcast.com. To join the conversation, follow us on Instagram at The Balanced Voice Podcast and on Twitter at @BalancedVoice_. Stay up to date on Runya's work by following her at The Runya Report, and we can't wait to see you next week for another Balanced Conversation.